there are people on the left. I mean, I prove this as a matter of fact, but as far as I can tell, there are people who are on the left, maybe Social Democrats, who think of themselves as being on the same spectrum as communists. They're not so far along it. Communism is just taking it a bit far, but they think they're on the same line. They don't think that they are something completely different. Are they right?
Yes, absolutely. Of course they are.
Well, don't you think there's a difference between accepting democracy and being a communist? Don't you think there's a difference between allowing free speech and being a communist? Being allowed to travel and being a communist? I mean, these seem to me major differences.
I think so, yes, but I think that if their ideas are taken to the logical conclusion. See, I don't think most people in the Soviet Union, I know the leaders of the Russian Revolution had no problem with, ending free speech and terror and all of that. They thought it was totally fine and necessary. They were living more than 100 years ago, to be fair, right? When this was pretty commonplace, in Russia. It's not like they took a democratic and peaceful and open society and made it into that. They continued, and in some cases made it worse. But of course, there's a difference between the 1930s in the Soviet Union and a social democrat or even a modern communist, I suspect, in the sense that there are certain things that they would accept, at least for now, when they're not in power, right? But if they were to be in power and attempting to implement their policies, they would quickly find that they're facing the same problem, which is a lot of people don't want to do this. And you're going to have to ratchet up the amount of power that you use in order to achieve your ends. Are they willing to create gulags? Well, at this point, I don't think there's any evidence of that.
But you're talking about people who aren't real communists. Real communists are willing to have a violent revolution. This is in the manifesto, a violent revolution to impose a socialist society in which people do not have substantial amount of property. So you're talking about sort of would-be communists, pretend communists. You're talking about real communists.
Well, it's very hard to know.
They're talking about Marxist communists, ones who follow the violent revolution that is recommended by Marx in the Communist Party manifesto.
Yeah, but there are a lot of people who will say, well, I want all the objectives achieved. I don't want to end democracy. I want us to vote for this communist utopia. So I think you can be a communist, or at least pretend to be one.
I think it is to pretend to be one. This is I'm sorry, I have to be a rigorous describer of communism. Communism is a violent revolution to overthrow the property-owning classes. And that is just
what if you could vote for that?
Explicit in if you could vote for that, you would still be taking it from the people who didn't want to give it up.
Well, but it was through the democratic process, is what they would argue, right?
Yeah. But I don't think that has never happened.
No,
it is no communist power has ever come to power through a democratic vote, because people don't vote. Turkeys do not vote for Christmas, and it's exactly the same thing. Most people have some vested interest in some property, and they don't want to give it up.
Well, I hope you continue to be right, James.
So do I. But let me one other thing is if you read the Communist Party manifesto, it has a long description about how wrong various other theorists of the extreme left are. But Marx wishes to make sure that all the other extreme leftists are put down and disagree with comprehensively, and it calls for a violent revolution. And then it says there will be a period of socialism in which the state owns everything, and then this will inevitably result in a communist society where there is no property. People will just share things, full stop. There is no detailed description at any point in that manifesto of what a communist society would actually be once it makes the transition from socialism to communism, which, by the way, has never happened in any country. But what I'm asking you is it a coincidence that there has never been a detailed description of what a communist society would actually look like if we ever got there?
I don't think it's a coincidence. And I think it's because it's a utopian vision. That, again, as we discussed, look, the way you describe it, like I say, it sounds like a family, right? You share things with your wife and children in a way that you don't really care so much about the ownership of them or who made them or whatever. That works at the level of the family. I do not think that works at the level of society. And so this is a utopian vision in which people effectively suspend their human nature, suspend their bonds to their family and loved ones in order to fulfill the needs and wishes of the state and in this great utopia. It's just, I don't think it's reality.
I mean, if there really was no property, I could ask you now for your mobile phone, and I could walk out with it. Because it's in any real sense yours. It's communal property.
Right.
I could take away the table, the camera lights, camera and the lights. Take away that picture over there. It's not yours. And you in this fantasy world would not object because
it would never be mine in the first place, right? It would would be allocated to me by the state. Look, James, I understand the rhetorical kind of back and forth that you and I are having, but I think one thing we ought to acknowledge, and this will sound a little bit snooty in some ways, but whenever I've talked to these people, the Ash Sarkars of the world, about this issue, I've always discovered that they haven't really thought very carefully about it at all. For example, I remember having a debate with Ash on the moral maze, in which we were talking about, she said, well, if you have a fridge full of food, is it not the government's job to make you give that food to the homeless and the poor? And I said to her, well, do you have a front door in your house? She said, yes. And I said, well, shouldn't the government put loads of homeless people in your house in violation of that? And I don't think it registers. They just haven't thought it through, because this isn't something where they've thought constructively about the solution that they're aiming for. They see a problem, which is inequality, people suffering, and they go, well, we must solve this. How do we solve this? Well, other people have more, therefore they have to give it, and they don't think about it more than that. I think we are pretending that this is a coherent political philosophy that has tangible, practical, real-world applications that have been explored and thought about. I don't think that's the case at all. I think this is pure ideology.
Yeah, and Marx very obviously made no effort to think about what it would actually consist of. In fact, avoided doing that. But he assumed. I mean, it is extraordinary when you think of a large part of human history in the 20th century was given over to experimenting with communism, and nobody had thought through what it might be like or whether it would actually work.
Well, communism and fascism, and I think the reason is, I think we ought to say, I think this is important to say, that it's not like communism and fascism came out of nowhere. It was a response, I think, to the Industrial Revolution and the tremendous disruption that had, and the kind of increasing sense that as societies were urbanizing and people were moving from the countryside into the cities, it was changing the way that people thought about freedom, the way that they thought about rights, the way that they thought about economics, the way they thought about equality, the fact that they could now see how much better the lives of other people around them were in a way that a peasant in rural Russia never would have done. So these ideologies don't come out of nowhere, but they are based on exactly the same problem that we just discussed, which is they are reactionary to the status quo without having any constructive dimension to them. They had some nice ideas, or some terrible ideas, about how societies would be when we ended the current problem, but they had no real vision that was accurate or workable for how to improve things. And it's sad that I think humanity unfortunately seems to move in these ways. We lurch from one extreme to another, to another, to another. And that pendulum that everyone keeps talking about, the way it swings like from left to right or wherever, it does seem, someone said on our show recently, it does seem to spend very little time in the middle.